Welcome to Spilling the Tea on SAS, where we synergize life and education. Every Monday, it's 8 to 9 p.m. here only at the Education Channel.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, I hope to be brief. It's a short report on qualitative work that I've done from part of the country, and it addresses the question of speculative establishment of the Haiyan Museum that will be established, proposed rather, next year on the 10th year anniversary. So I'll begin with the abstract. To commemorate the tragic event of the super typhoon Yolanda, or the international name Haiyan, last 2013, local leaders of the province of Leyte, Philippines, are speculating on establishing a Haiyan museum on 2023, a decade later, as a more lasting testament of tragedy, aside from, for instance, a glass stand with a few names of dead persons within the vicinity. One way to look at the speculative decade-inspired establishment is through Amy Sodaro's memorial museums under the interplay of education-based memorialization and commemoration, that is, remembering with the community. Juxtaposing this interplay with Paul Morrow's philosophical perception of objects in memorial museums as possible provocateurs of repulsive feelings, there is a lingering suspicion of whether exhibits in the museum can really flesh out educational therapeutic reflections or healing. Contrary to other memorial museums of tragedy with few living survivors or first-person witnesses of horror, like Holocaust museums worldwide, one could imagine that most or a lot of native visitors would be survivors of the region, so that the experience of seeing objects from the recent past may, among others, awaken personal or collective traumatic feelings. The crucial question to be addressed then is, will this Haiyan Museum house feelings of healing 10 years later, or trauma? To answer this question, I take insights from Survivor-Curators, or the museum curators of Region 8, Philippines, who experienced the Haiyan tragedy at or proximate to the landfall and aftermath firsthand. The notion of a survivor-curator is a vital coinage that would represent a close perception of the museum and its museum objects. I then thematize the responses into a more coherent discussion. As museums in their participatory turns are tapped to be spaces of social care, such themes can reflect further on the communal aspect of museums and further museum projects. So to outline my presentation, I will discuss first about Haiyan, the Haiyan experience, and the Haiyan Museum proposal, and then I will proceed to the short discussion, memorial museums, trauma, and dark tourism. Um, I will introduce the participants of the study and the notion of a survivor-curator, which is something that I've coined, the method of the study, and in the results part, the impressions on the proposal, the supposed contents for the museum objects of this Haiyan Museum, um, the answer to the question of whether um, it will be traumatic or therapeutic, and some other feelings involved, um, learning from a Haiyan museum, and whether the curators recommend the museum in the end. And finally, I will make some. So I will begin with the discussion on Haiyan, a brief one. Of course, for those who are in the Philippines, we know that Haiyan was the most powerful storm in 2015, and one of the most powerful typhoons of all time, with maximum wind power of 195 kilometers per hour or 120 miles per hour. And it is also the costliest typhoon so far in the Philippines, with damages totaling of 2.2 billion US dollars. So in terms of the experience, I've asked the curators themselves, and one was away and was shocked at the telegenic appearances, did some volunteering, but one was speechless, and she said that it's very hard to explain, except for the fact that she considers it her second life, right? And some described it as horrifying and fearful and devastating. So this proposal is again to make a more lasting testament of the tragedy, aside from this photo over here that has a glass stand with the names of the dead people within the vicinity. Um, in the philosophical import of this is based on the idea of memorial museums, trauma, and what we call dark tourism. And I will base this on Amy Sadaro's exhibiting atrocity, memorial museums, and the politics of past violence. Paul Morrow's Our Holocaust Museum is unique, and John Lennon and Malcolm Foley's Dark Tourism, the attractions of death and disaster. So the idea that past experiences of violence can be tools for memorialization and healing is argued by Amy Sodario in Memorial Museums. She claimed that this is a new hybrid cultural form of commemoration between the past and education, and it has three primary functions. It is a form of historical truth-telling, and that is to preserve the past and serve as a record, complete with material and documentary evidence of what happened. Second, it is meant to be places of healing and restoration. It serves as symbolic reparations for the individuals, communities, and nations that were injured. And finally, it is intended to be spaces for moral education. And the purpose is not just to reach the intellectual curiosity of the visitors, but also their emotional aspect. And in her analysis, she focuses on the creation of these museums. And there's a stress on the political context because they engage in human rights abuses and so on. And she provides close reading of the exhibitions themselves, the curation that will encourage empathy. And finally, the museum would act as a public institution where communities can engage for public dialogue and democratic spaces. So she notes 5 examples of this. One is the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which opened in Washington in 1993. And then Budapest Terror Haza, or House of Terror, which showcases Hungary's violent 20th century under first fascist and then communist occupation. Third, we have the Kigali Genocide Memorial Center, which opened in 2004 to mark the 10th anniversary of the 1994 Rwandan genocide with the Hutus and the Tutsis, right? And then the Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos, the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago Chile, which opened in January 2010 as the National Site for Remembrance and Education about the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet from 1973 to 1990. And finally, the latest one is the National September 11 Memorial Museum, which opened in 2014 in New York. Now, those museums are supposed to be institutions for healing, right? But Paul Morrow, in this collection that my supervisor collected, 2000, that's 2016, on this emerging field of philosophy of museums, argues that Holocaust museums aren't really unique because they are just they still are basically museums of history, and therefore memorial museums are also part of these museums of history categorization. And one of the crucial aspects of a museum of history is the ability of particular objects to create strong feelings of revulsion in their viewers. And so it welcomes the possibility that it can instill trauma. So the question of this paper then is, will a Haiyan museum then invoke healing or trauma? Right? And this is in the context of what we call dark tourism that has been published last 2000. Dark tourism, also referred to as thanatourism, refers to tourism at sites of grief, death, and suffering, and has been receiving increased scholarly attention in recent years. What makes the Haiyan study a unique form of dark tourism is that the emphasis is not on human atrocities, but natural disasters. And it is only recently that museums are explicitly tapped to address climate change issues. So in this study, my participants are this this would be the sociology and demographics. There are 9 of them, and 5 are females, 3 are males, 1 identified as homosexual. As to age, 4 are less than 35, 3 are in between 36 to 45, and 2 are almost retiring, are more than 55. And their preferred tag names are um, J, Dior, Lay, Nils, Jill, Joy, Mel, John, and CJ. So they represent the following art or heritage institutions in Region 8, and 1 is affiliated with the National Commission for Culture and the Arts National Committee on Museums. So they have been 5 were affiliated in their institutions in less than 10 years, 2 are in between 10 to 20, and 2 are working almost 30 years. Now, the notion of a survivor-curator refers to me as an individual who experienced a typhoon or its aftermath, and whose professional capacity covers that of overseeing or involving oneself in the transmission of knowledge or showing expertise regarding museums and their museum objects. So this coinage then does not merely represent the professional capacity of a curator only, but also of other museum-related professionals whose tie to the Haiyan experience lies in their link to their well-being and relationships. So there are overlapping professional expertise and capacities here, or offices. 5 identified as curator, 2 as museum directors, 3 as educators, 1 is a conservationist, 1 is a historian, 5 are researchers, 1 is a psychometrician, and 1 is a municipal tourism operations officer. This notion of a survivor curator banks on the difference between national disasters and Holocaust experiences, because the distribution and experience are different in each historical situation. Right? Like last year, there was a seminar by the Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Center with the participation of the University of Macau, where there was a seminar first from a Holocaust expert, and we had a virtual tour of the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum in Israel. And lastly, there was a sharing from a Greek Auschwitz survivor. And Lola Angel, the survivor, was one of the survivors of the 83% of 59,000 Greek Jews who were exterminated in the Nazi concentration camps. And for 7 decades, she hasn't spoken about the horrific experience. Right? And one of the quotable things that can be learned from her sharing was, she said, "I was but a child, but I forgot nothing. The memories still haunt me, and the intense smells of the camp are ever present." So the survivor modifier is nuanced and is context dependent. A Haiyan survivor experienced the harshness of natural disasters. A Holocaust survivor experienced the atrocities of human violence. The duration of the experience highly depends on the capacity of the survivor to move on. So in my method, I use survey, Google Forms, and messenger calls and follow-up chats. In the results, the survivors were asked on their impressions first, and they're they were mostly in support of a Haiyan museum. They say it's okay, it's timely and relevant, it's educational for environmental awareness, cultural sensitivity, and empowerment. But also there were positions like it brings back repressed traumatic memories. In the end, they think that it's necessary. And we must be careful about the traumatic element. On the contents of this, on the objects of this museum, aside from objects like paintings from local artists, most survivor creators suggest survivor narratives, especially those which exist in a temporal framework, like before Haiyan, during Haiyan, and after Haiyan, that will make up a good storyline. And so this must be people-oriented and survivor-sensitive. One said that the best feature is how the affected places and people would rise up and continue to be resilient after. So now these are the responses about whether it will invoke healing or trauma. Clearly, there is a certain aspect of contingency that is at play, and there is no absolute way of saying whether it's purely trauma or it's purely healing. But one contingency is that it's object dependent. It depends on the contents of the museum. And second, CJ thinks that it's not only in the objects, but on how the objects are presented or the curation or presentation of the objects. However, there is a third contingency which is at play, and that would depend on the perception of the museum visitor, who may also be a survivor, as it depends on the person's acceptance of the event, depending on the depth and gravity of one's experience. The other feelings that are evoked aside from trauma and healing would be, on the one hand, pain, grief, anxiety, depression, fear, sadness, and guilt. On the other hand, there are also lessons in survival, hope, joyful moments, and mainly the overcoming of pain to realize healing. Some curators argue that you need to have a sort of preparation first or debriefing after the museum tour. And we need a psychological expert. Incidentally, the psychological expert, who is also a curator, thinks that um, she rules out the possibility of healing at this point. And for her, psychologically, there's only trauma. For me, it will be traumatic, she claims. Memorializing the horrifying experience of Yolanda Haiyan is not something therapeutic, according to her psychological expertise. But again, interestingly, even with the traumatic possibility in viewing the objects that can bring bad memories, um, one says that the museum is necessary for the future. The museum objects, accordingly, would be necessarily therapeutic because it will provide healing and empowering the survivors. This empowerment can take the form of epistemological or knowledge transmission, sustainability, and inclusivity, right? And one um, very nice answer to this was provided by Joy, who said that to be empowered, um, the purpose is to be empowered through knowledge of history, science, and cultures, the sense of connection with the rest of humanity, to be healed and help heal, understand the politics of disaster, respect the sacred in disaster communities, help improve relief, recovery, and rehabilitation systems, help set policies in the protocol and management of disaster dead, lift the spirits of people and communities, strengthen human potential, be concerned with the children, youth, elderly persons with disabilities, and indigenous people. In other words, this healing as empowerment rests on the feeling or resolve of overcoming. So how can we learn from a Haiyan museum? It is, of course, a house of memory, and for Jay, there are three main important learnings. One is that there is an inevitable role of natural disasters in our lives, seeing that the Philippines is um, prone to typhoons and hurricanes, and the challenge of addressing the risks they bring. Second, it will serve as a reminder of how painful a disaster can bring vis-a-vis the concern of preparedness. And third, it's a matter of acceptance and moving on. Some others also said that it portrays the many ways on how to be resilient. And one said that we shouldn't be too dependent with our government. We can also make some um, communitarian ways to cope. And then still, the museum should help us learn to love our planet, nature, and communities. We must have interactive approaches to educate the next generations. So on the question of whether or not they will recommend the establishment of the museum, all of the survivor curators except one are amenable in recommending it. And the opposition, the sole opposition, is saying that memorializing it will be really tough for these vulnerable individuals. However, for those who agree, this memorializing is viewed as a positive thing. There is the intergenerational and educational reason, uh, which will form the necessity of its establishment. And positively, it will immortalize the strength and resiliency of our people. Um, and by our people, the museum should be inclusive, not just in Tacloban, but also in Eastern Visayas, Eastern Samar. And this means that its establishment would cater to the cooperation of everyone in the region, which means to tap private institutions, NGOs, and so on and so forth. So what I can conclude from this is that a Haiyan museum is, based on the insights of the Survivor-Curators, a necessary establishment. Its value is intergenerational and pedagogical. It is necessarily an institution of healing, even at the level of the community. But again, while it is different from highly politicized memorial museums because its focus is on the environment and its relationship with the people, there are similar limitations of the reality of suffering affecting this type of memorial museum. Thank you very much for listening.